So yeah, thank you everyone for coming to the Living with the Fire panel discussion for those living in the Salish Sea. And I would like to invite Robert George, who will be providing a formal welcome. And I'm going to ask all the panelists to turn off their videos. And then after he's done, to come back on with your videos.
Well, thank you to Island Trust for hosting this webinar this evening and talking about the element of fire. Just want to share a song. It's a song called the Mother Earth Song. Sharing and thanking everyone for being here tonight and for the caretakers of the land that we're going to be speaking about this evening of how to caretake for the land. And the fire, our people always relate the elements to the attitudes and behaviors of the human beings, and fire is becoming very prevalent, and with fire is a lot of action oriented where people are just really moving really quick and just doing things without thinking about other people. You really see that happening a lot all around the world, and when it goes out of control, it burns a lot of people. If we don't control that element of respect and kindness and generosity, fire people tend to be they'll always say something and not worry about how it affects people around them. And a lot of times they'll say it without even knowing they hurt somebody. And so a lot of that happens, and fire people are very impatient a lot of times. Wonders, let's get on with it. Enough talking. Let's go. Let's get something done. And so I've always shared before that everything in motion is going like this, going faster and faster and faster. And how can we slow that motion down? To propose that to have a fire ceremony going on the island and sit around the fire for 12 or 24 hours and then just talk about the element of fire when compared to the attitudes and behaviors of humans and how it affects all things. So it's bringing that ceremony of fire, to the people. And fire can be warming to a person, but also it can be very damaging to a person. So that's always that both sides of everything, just to bring consultation and conversation, bringing that ceremony of fire into the people. So we'll just share a bit more as we go along this evening. HCM, Farmer Relations. Thank you.
So if I can ask all the panelists to come back on with your video. Thank you, Robert. Thank you so much for your words. I'm going to ask if all the panelists can turn off their sound. And I'm just going to do a quick little introduction. So yes, thank you, Robert, for those lovely words. And before I invite Ruth Waldick, who is the moderator for this evening, my name's Jillian, and I've worked for Islands Trust for over 5 years now in various roles. And tonight I will be co-hosting and supporting the admin side of the webinar along with my coworker Morgana, who's already reached out and mentioned in our in the Q&A box to where people can ask questions. So we'll be supporting throughout the webinar and the behind the scenes. And before I pass it over to Ruth, I'm just going to mention that this webinar is part of the Stewardship Education Program, where Islands Trust offers programming to help the public preserve and protect the islands in the trust area. This program has included mailing new property owners with information on the land, providing island-specific information on services, and hosting speaker series and webinars like this. We actually had 2 webinars last month. Maybe some of you joined us, and you can find those recordings on the website, which I'll show in just a minute here. So this is the housekeeping part of things. So we are recording the webinar, so we'll post it to the website. We had almost 400 people register for this webinar, which is crazy to us. We've never had that many people register, and of course not all of them have come tonight. Everyone, yeah. And so what we'll do with the recording is we'll post it to the website, and we'll have you can watch it after this event, or you can share somebody the link. So it's going to be available for everybody, as well as the PowerPoint slides, and any other materials that kind of come up during this event, we'll share on the website. So while the presentation is running, we encourage you to ask questions. And as you saw, maybe you didn't, but down below the Q&A function, you can just type in your question there, and it'll get prompted by Morgana and I, and we'll put them in the queue of questions. If you're having any issues with Zoom, you can email your question at communications@islandstrust.bc.ca. However, we encourage you to ask your question in the Q&A section of Zoom down below. We advise that you ask general questions on this topic. And yes, it's an Islands Trust hosted webinar, but none of the staff are here present. So maybe avoid asking any specific Islands Trust related questions, because our panelists won't know how to answer them. And then just to mention, we may paraphrase your question or slightly alter it. Or if there's multiples of the same question, we're going to group those so you can get as many questions in as possible. And if a bunch of questions that we just don't get to because we get prompted with it's too many to answer, we're going to make a sheet and we'll get the presenters to answer the questions, hopefully, and then post them on the website next to the recording. And then you can find everything on the Stewardship Education webpage. And it looks like I deleted my page. So I'll show maybe at the end, but it's just the Stewardship Education webpage on the Islands Trust website. And all the recordings are under there. So before I take up too much time, I'm going to pass it over to Ruth, and she will introduce everyone and get going. All right, Ruth, go ahead.
Thank you, Jillian. And Kwehot Haichka for the song, and also for sharing that insight, because I actually remember that I am a fire person, and so I myself got some direct wisdom from from you sharing that. And I think it's a beautiful idea about having a fire ceremony where you spend actual time thinking and talking about fire. It's what a beautiful idea. So for people, many people probably don't know me. My name is Ruth Waldick, and I was very pleased to receive a request from Island Trust to organize a discussion of some kind on the topic of fire for people who are living in the Salish Sea in the Island Trust area. And I was very pleased to do this because my background is actually in the ecologist and looking specifically in the last 20 years at climate impacts and adaptation with a specific focus on fire since I've been working in this region. And over the last 5 years, we're talking to people such as the panelists that you see here and many other professionals in this region. There are many things to talk about, and it is a really fascinating conversation. And so I'm very pleased to have this panel brought in to speak to you, and they'll be covering a big range about fire, so that hopefully your perspective on fire will change as we go through this, because what we will be speaking about is why are we concerned about fire and what's the current state of how we understand fire in our specific area, because we hear things on the news and we don't know what's relevant and what isn't. And then what do we need to know? So what are the interconnections between the place and the things we care about and fire? And as Kweho said, this is not always a bad thing. And then what can we do? What are some of the practical things? That's what the Island Trust really wants, is us to have a conversation. So I'm going to begin with Robert Gray as the first panelist. Robert's going to start with the big picture and to help us to settle in thinking about this topic of fire, because you've been doing other things in your day. So Robert Gray is a certified wildland fire ecologist, and I should point out that fire ecologists are very rare. They're very rare creatures in British Columbia. We really don't have very many of them, and so it's really, it's really very special to have the opportunity to speak with one of them. And so really take advantage of that. And we're going to try to make good time for questions. Robert has been the president of Gray Consulting Limited, and he's got over 40 years of experience. And I had to abbreviate that because there's a lot in 40 years. But mostly what I want to point out is that it's not just the experience with fire and the research and the application of Western fire science, but also his interests are in looking at the historical and cultural fire regimes, reconstructing fire and fire behavior, and understanding and analyzing the effects of fire. And this scope is actually quite big, going from policy and working in Canada and the United States, and also with First Nations communities as well. So he's got a huge range of experience. And most recently, what Robert's been working on is understanding the impact of past fires on the future fire spread, severity, fuel treatment, and thinking about things at the landscape scale, because everything is connected. And so I will just pass over to Bob with no more delay to introduce us to the topic of fire.
Thank you very much, Ruth. I feel like I'm an endangered species that just crawled out from under the rock. I guess that would include Becky and I. So thank you so much for the invitation to speak with you tonight. This is a topic, obviously, at the 40 so much interested in. And I'm so thankful that I can practice here in BC and just continue to learn as I go. Next slide, just jump right into things here. So this is a couple of points here. I'm going to try to cover off on all these things within the allotted time. So coastal BC is a large region, large range in ecosystems and different fire environments. We basically are ranges from extremely wet to fairly dry. Climate change is occurring certainly, but it's not occurring in a steady state pattern. And we'll talk and I'll explain what that means. Climate change is what we're facing in the future is more driven by extreme events, anomalous extreme events. And that's hard to manage for, but it's something that is basic. That's the pattern that we're looking at in the future. And a lot of this focus is that I'll talk about is fuels. That's really what drives the system. So we can't change the weather, topography, but we can change fuels. And Conor and Becky will be speaking in more depth on that topic. Next slide. So you may have heard the term fire regime. It's what we use to describe fire's relationship with different ecosystems. BC is a huge province with just amazing biodiversity and just a huge, just the expanse of the province is significant. So from a fire regime perspective, starting at that 30,000 meter level, we've got extremely dry, high frequency, low severity fire regimes historically in the interior, Okanagan, Kootenays, east side of Vancouver Island, parts of the Gulf Islands. And then we kind of broaden through more moist, less frequent, higher severity systems, and we kind of look to the north where we have fairly infrequent, but very high severity systems. Embedded within each of those, though, is a lot of variability. The other way we can look at fire regimes is, are they fuel limited or are they climate limited systems? And I'll go into a lot more detail on that in a minute. And climate characteristics are really driving fire behavior in these systems. So the other part of fire regimes that's important to understand is what were the ignition sources? And what we find throughout BC was that it was this coupling of both indigenous use of fire and lightning. And in some places, it was predominantly fire stewardship through indigenous peoples on those landscapes. It was a form of survival, it was food security. So next slide. So the Gulf Islands and the San Juan Archipelago, fuels are abundant. These are very warm, moist systems. They're very productive. Some places where there's deep soils are more productive than areas where there's shallower soils. But basically, fuels are abundant. But these are climate limited systems. So basically, climate, which is the top-down driver, it has a huge influence on fire behavior. What we're seeing now is this significant change in fire weather patterns and how that's going to affect fire behavior and fuels. So both seasonal and diurnal changes to temperature. Seasonally, winters are warmer than they have been historically. Seasonal diurnal changes in relative humidity. You may have seen some news items in the last week or so about how fires are continuing to burn aggressively at night. So basically, we're not seeing that diurnal pattern of rising relative humidity and cooling fire behavior. So in some cases, in the heat of summer, relative humidity is really not rising high enough to retard fire behavior. It's not returning moisture to prime fuels, and fires are burning aggressively at night. Last year in the Donny Creek fire, colleagues of ours at BC Wildfire Service were doing burnout operations at 2 o'clock in the morning. So early in my career, back in the early 80s, we could fight fire at night because fire kind of sat down. It's not doing that so much anymore. Increased incidence and magnitude of these stalled high pressure systems or megadomes like the heat dome in 2021. This is due to what's called a lazy jet stream. When you have a significant temperature gradient between the Arctic and the tropics, it provides a bit of a speed to the jet stream. And when there's not a lot of temperature difference between the Arctic and the tropics, it slows the jet stream down and it stalls and it just sits there. So that's how we get these heat domes, which can last for a week, 2 weeks, and give us stifling temperatures. Increased vapor pressure deficit, that's the ability of the air, it's the aridity of the air, and it pulls moisture out of fuels. We're actually finding that fuels are drier than we thought they were. It's time to basically update our allometric tables and our algorithms because they're outdated. Increased strong wind events, especially dry cold fronts. If you were watching the news at all last summer, there were periods when, especially in the north and the Northwest Territories and Northern Alberta, dry cold fronts came through and fires spread 50, 60 kilometers in one burning period. So that's the result of these increased strong wind events. Increased precipitation in some regions, but the models are suggesting changed patterns to that. So not likely going to get those nice, long, light wetting rains, more likely to get more convective cells. And that's not good if those convective storms sit on top of recently, high burn severity burn scars. Increased occurrence and magnitude of droughts. We're in one now. We've been in one for the last couple of years. We may come out due to La Nina, or we may not. But drought is going to be a significant part of our future, and that has a big impact on stand resilience. And lastly, lightning. For every 1 degree C increase in global air temperature, we're going to see a 12% increase in lightning. And we're already seeing that across the province. So, next slide. So all of this top-down has an impact on fuel availability, and that fuel availability is driven by fuel moisture. Next slide. So one of these interesting sort of weather patterns that we have is, one of them is the land breeze. So this is where we have that high pressure system parked in the interior, and we get these dry, high temperature outflow winds. And outflow meaning they go from the land to the sea. Those wind patterns, because of low relative humidity, high temperature, and strong winds, the ability to pull moisture out of fuels, those are the ones of most concern for fire behavior in the Salish Sea and in the San Juan Archipelago and on Southeast Vancouver Island, because those are the ones that are going to dry out the fine fuels. It's fine fuels that catch and start to increase fire size. Next slide. The converse of that is the sea breeze, and that's basically systems coming off the Pacific, coming up Puget Sound, and those tend to be moist, low pressure systems, and they wet fine fuels. If they're long duration, they can actually recharge large fuels, but for the most part, these systems, they have a dampening effect on potential fire behavior. Relative humidity stays high, temperature stays low, and fuels stay nice and wet. So, next slide. The other kind of important regional pattern is the rain shadow. And that's from both the Olympic Mountains to the southwest, as well as to the west and southwest from the Vancouver Island ranges. And when you lie in the lee side of that, some of those moist systems, they'll hit those mountains and they'll rise orographic lifting, and they'll subsidence on the downhill side of that, and they'll actually dry out. So that rain shadow can have a significant effect on fuel drying. So something that we're going to see, over time as we see the shift in climate is changes to live fuel. So phenology is kind of the seasonal patterns of growth, and physiology is kind of the fuel moisture patterns within those fuels. So we don't typically think about shrubs and herbs as, being an available fuel, especially in the summertime. And, in the interior, it usually takes a frost before those things are available. 2021, shrubs and herbs and grasses were available to burn by about late June. So that was a physiological change. Things dried out very quickly. Longer term with climate change, phenologically, they're likely going to change. So, as soil moisture has a big impact due to climate change, then plants are going to probably start growing sooner, but they're probably going to go into senescence and cure sooner as well. So some of those impacts are due to seasonal drought, heat domes, and periods of high vapor pressure deficit. Down the road, we're likely going to see a significant change in live fuels and their contribution to fire behavior, and especially species that have high resin content in their foliage. It's going to start to behave a little bit more like chaparral in California and Arizona. Next. Large fuels are the other problem. Like I said, these are very productive systems. The current generalized trend, I see this is a very busy sort of chart, but I'll break it down for you here. So the current sort of trend with large fuels is that they recharge over the winter, not completely, but they recharge enough moisture that they exceed that red line, which is the moisture of extinction. So they basically have absorbed enough moisture that they're not available to burn. And kind of late April, May, in a dry year, they can actually become available for a short period of time. And then we hope and pray for those June rains, and they somewhat recharge those fuels. And then they become available for a period of time in the fall. That's been the kind of historical normative pattern with some variation. Next slide. What we're likely going to see, though, is longer periods when those fuels are available. And unfortunately, due to drought, overstock stands, increased loading of those large fuels as well. So especially if they're suspended off the ground. They stay air dried for quite a bit longer. So June rains on some years may recharge, but we can't rely on that in the future. And chances are that we're just going to have a longer period when these larger fuels are available. And there's significant consequences to those fuels that Becky and Conor can speak to. So next slide. There's also a lot of there's sort of micro scale variability in fuels too, and that's going to change over time. So if we think about south exposure, steep ground, in the Salish Sea on the islands and the south coast, very shallow soils. So those sites dry out, those fuels dry out. So the highest degree of change in fuel availability is likely going to be on warm aspects, steep slopes with shallow soils. They're going to dry out the quickest. Lower slopes, toe of the slope on soft aspects, moderate as well. The places where we're likely to see the least impact is, steep toe of the slope on north aspects, where there's basically topoadaptic influence on soil moisture, and they're shaded a bit more there. So we're likely to see less change there, but doesn't mean we stack those areas full of fuels because they can dry out in some years. So next slide. And we contribute to this, fuel availability as well through a lot of our different sort of land practices. Agricultural forest management as a model, we don't really think about fuels from that perspective. It's an economic treatment, so we're basically trying to capture as much economic value as we can. But in the process, we end up sometimes just rearranging fuels. Thinning without burning is basically just taking canopy fuels and applying them to the surface. So whether it's commercial harvest, pre-commercial thinning, spacing, slashing, they tend to generate a lot of fuels. And it's a completely different set of objectives when we're doing vegetation management, but we're removing the fuels. And that's kind of the focus that we need to steer toward. Another one, static reserves in dynamic systems. These ecosystems are all highly dynamic. They've evolved with some disturbance, mostly fire in a lot of cases. And anytime we sort of draw a polygon on a map and say, thou shalt not go in there, we're setting it up for potential catastrophic disturbance. So we have to treat dynamic systems dynamically and not statically. And we've also seen significant conversion of ecosystems in the Salish Sea, in the San Juans, and southern Vancouver Island, where we used to have historically open prairies, hardwoods, mixed hardwoods and conifers. And now we have completely conifer-dominated systems. And that has a whole other range of issues when it comes to fire behavior and fire effects. So what's the future of on the risk of fire? So annual probabilities is it's one way to look at it. So we set the system up where it's hot, dry, windy. We've got lots of fuels. It's a matter of probabilities whether or not we actually have fires. So one way we can look on it is on an annual basis, the risk of fires with significant consequences are going to increase. I mean, it's just the state of where things are going when it comes to climate change. If the historic risk of bad fire conditions was, for example, 10 days a year in 2000, the probability will likely double that by 2030. However, we are in a whole new situation here where there is no historic analog. We can't look to the past 10, 15, 20 years and develop a normative curve and say, well, here's the norm and here's 1 or 2 standard deviations, and that's what it's going to be. It's all off the charts. We're starting anew here. And unfortunately, if we look at 2023, that is likely going to be in the future a cool year. So probabilities are increasing, but the most important thing I think to think about and take away from this, from the sort of climate and fire weather perspective for the Salish Sea, is that a lot of what happens is going to be driven by these anomalous events. The heat domes that last for a period of time that dry things out very, very quickly early in the year and set us up for that longer probability where we have just a greater chance we're going to get the ignitions or we're going to get the fire behavior. Next slide. I find this to be a very great graphic. I don't know if you can just click the screen and hit the animation, but a small change in averages leads to big changes in extremes. So if we've seen, this sort of incremental change in temperature, that just means that our extremes are going to be 1, 2, 3 standard deviations off of that. So we're going to be driven by extreme things. And we've seen this around the globe. So the 2019, 2020 fires in Australia, that started out as a very anomalous event. The fires in 2020 in California, those were modeled to happen around 2035, and they happened 15 years earlier. What happened last year in BC was also modeled and predicted to not really happen in BC until maybe 2035 again, and it happened 12 years early. So we're seeing more and more of these extreme events. Next slide. And the kind of common perception of climate change caused effects is that it's a simple linear relationship, and that it's climbing at a very steady rate, and out there in the future is some critical threshold. And unfortunately, policy-wise, I think we're stuck in a bit of a box where we're thinking we have time, and that it's not my problem to fix, it's someone else's 10, 20, 15 years down the road, and we can cruise along. Next slide. Unfortunately, with these extreme anomalous events, we can hit that critical threshold tomorrow. We can hit it next year. We can hit it in 2 years' time. So we can't rest on our laurels and say that I think we have time. We're in it, and we have a responsibility now to try to get out of it. There is no delay. We have to basically act very quickly and aggressively. Next slide. It's all yours, Ruth.
Okay, well, so I think you got everyone's attention, Bob. So if I were to just set a context for what we just heard from Bob, just the reminder being that the number of days per year is still relatively small. And so to me, this is the really hopeful thing. If we understand what we need to be watching for and what vulnerabilities are, then we can start thinking like stewards. And that's what where we're heading with the next panelists, is thinking about our role in the landscape, given all the various things that we value and the things that we want to retain as stewards. And that's why this is called Living with Fire, because as Bob's pointed out, fire is going to come. Some of the good news that I have heard is that this change from the very conifer dominated stands to reintroducing, even among foresters, and shifting to more deciduous and more interrupted sort of dynamic systems, is already being practiced in Pacific Northwest of the United States. So there are things that are changing, and it's a matter of just understanding it. So now I'm going to shift to Conor. So Conor Corbett is going to take us down a scale to think about it more where we are near our homes, still at a landscape scale, but at a much more localized Salish Sea sort of scale. Conor is a registered professional forester. He works with Frontera Forest Solutions. Conor's been working for 15 years in wildfire and forestry, and that includes, actually being on the land and dealing with things. So he has 6 years as a type 1 initial attack firefighter, crew leader, and a strike team leader. So he's actually seen fire and been in fire, as has Bob and Becky. So we have, a lot of interesting perspective here. Conor has master's in forestry from UBC, where he studied wildfire preparedness. And this is really, seems to be an area of particular interest for Conor. So he continues to work on community preparedness and fire resilience with local governments, First Nations, industry, and land developers. And that includes in 2023, Conor was working with the consulting company that did a community fire plan and hazard assessment for the San Juans and the Southern Gulf Islands. And so Conor has some really local knowledge to share with us from that experience. Thanks, Conor.
Yeah, thanks for the intro, Ruth, and thanks for the great presentation, Bob. There's some things I'm good to get a build off of there. And yeah, like Ruth said, I've completed many community wildfire plans in the Southern Gulf Islands in the coastal Douglas fir ecosystem. That's just turned out to be what I'm specialized in for wildfire community planning. And what I'm going to talk about is taking what Bob has said and really trying to put it in our backyards here in the CDF ecosystem so we can understand what types of wildfires to expect, what this wildfire risk means, and how we can prepare for it most effectively. Next slide, please. So these are a couple maps that I've excerpted from previous wildfire plans I've produced. We have Galliano over there on the left, Salt Spring in the middle, and then a bunch of the other Southern Gulf Islands on the right. I won't dwell on these too much. These are prepared for local government at a local government scale. So as you can see, we're at this zoomed out scale. And I'm sure if anyone in this webinar lives in any of these areas, you're immediately trying to find your home and your address here to see what the wildfire risk is. And you're probably a little frustrated because all the private land is blacked out in these maps. And that's an unfortunate limitation of when we're working at this scale for this particular type of client. But I urge you not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. These maps and assessments are really useful for giving us that broader context. And once we dive into some of those factors and what we mean by this local wildfire risk, I'm hopeful we can all fill in the blanks and at least have a deeper understanding of what this local wildfire risk means. And outside of the gray, as you can see, on the public land we've assessed, we have a lot of yellow and a little bit of orange. And that basically means we have mostly a moderate wildfire risk when we're looking at this scale. And that's really, really common in the coastal Douglas fir using the methodology we use. Next slide, please. So this is a pretty typical coastal Douglas fir forest. Unfortunately, I took this photo a couple months ago, so it's in the winter, so it's not maybe the best example, but at least shows some of the big factors we're looking at. As you can see, we have lots of Douglas fir trees. I would call this pretty moderate density. Maybe for some people in their backyards, the trees are a lot larger, there's a little lower density. And this is, I'd say, pretty typical moderate wildfire risk forest, depending on its location, how close it is to values. And if this is the kind of thing that you look out your back window and you see, and it's right beside your house, I think it's pretty clear that this is a moderate wildfire risk. This is a moderate wildfire risk or even a high wildfire risk if it's really close to your home. And there are areas of really high wildfire risk in the coastal Douglas fir ecosystem in the Gulf Islands, but it's pretty atypical. Those are usually going to be really steep slopes with lots of grass or maybe really dense immature trees. Generally, it's going to be in that moderate wildfire risk. And next slide, please. I'm going to explain what we actually mean by moderate wildfire risk, because I think that's kind of a confusing term for a lot of people. And it is technical. It's a technical assessment. And remember, we're working at this large scale, but generally what I mean by a moderate wildfire risk is that wildfire can be expected during normal summer weather in the Southern Gulf Islands and in the rest of the coastal Douglas fir. And what we mean by these moderate wildfires, they're relatively small. Again, we're looking at this like larger scale. So less than 5 hectares, the rates of spread are moderate, which for me means maybe less than 1 meter a minute for fire spread. Most of the larger trees are going to survive that fire. It's going to be mostly a surface fire with flame lengths, maybe less than a meter, maybe just a little bit more than a meter. And we expect really high likelihood of successful control by the BC Wildfire Service and the fire department. And when I say a high likelihood of successful control, I mean that the spread of that fire has been limited within 24 hours. And I think moderate wildfire risk captures that aspect of what the wildfires we think at. But remember, we are working at this landscape level scale. A hectare is about the size of a soccer pitch. So yeah, 5 hectares sounds small on the landscape, but if that 5 hectares is right behind your house or really close to your house, that's really concerning. That's really frightening, and that can be really damaging and impactful. Next slide, please. And so this is the aftermath of a pretty typical wildfire in the South Coast. This was in 2018 in Maple Mountain, which is just by Crofton, just on the south coast of Vancouver Island, opposite Salt Spring. This is a really typical coastal Douglas fir forest, lots of semi-mature Douglas fir, larger Douglas fir, lots of arbutus in here. this is in a really optimal location for a response. It's about 5 minutes away from a local fire department. There's a BC Wildfire Service base very close, and there's a very rapid response. But in the end, this fire was 6 hectares. It was pretty vigorous surface fire, and it took about 24 hours for the spread to be captured. So it's really capturing that narrative, that moderate wildfire risk narrative. And 6 hectares, again, not that big when we're talking at a large scale, but that's 8 soccer fields. That's pretty big if it's happening close to your home, and that's pretty frightening. And it was spreading. It was spreading for quite a while before it was captured. And I'll go to the next slide, please. And although a vast majority of the wildfire risk we expect is for those smaller fires, catastrophic wildfires are still possible. And this is something that Bob was alluding to in his presentation. And when I say a catastrophic wildfire, I mean something very large, thousands of hectares, and it's very intense. Trees are getting completely consumed and combusted in this wildfire. And these are the types of fires that we do not expect successful suppression to occur. We are going to need help from Mother Nature to catch these fires. And the good news is that these types of wildfires require those very specific weather conditions Bob was talking about. Those outflow winds are basically mandatory for us to get these really catastrophic wildfires. And those occur very infrequently. And the unfortunate news is that those weather conditions are going to increase in frequency with climate change. I'll go to the next slide. And here's an example of a rare high severity wildfire in the coastal Douglas fir ecosystem. This is the Nanaimo Lakes wildfire of 2018. I took this photo in 2020, so a lot of the area has been salvage logged since then, so it's not a perfect post-wildfire picture, but it does show that we have seen a lot of trees get consumed in this wildfire. This had a really significant response from the BC Wildfire Service with multiple helicopters, several air tankers dropping fire retardant, lots of firefighters, and the total size was about 200 hectares before they managed to catch it, and it was spreading very rapidly before they managed to catch it. And this is a fairly good example, I think, of the types of large wildfires that we can expect to see that with very low frequency. The temperature on this day was 34 degrees and really low relative humidity of 25%. And the wind was about 20 kilometers coming from the east. So classic outflow weather conditions, classic conditions for severe wildfire in the CDF. And one of the things, this photo can be scary and the story can be scary, but remember, these fires are very rare. There's only a handful of examples I can think of in the CDF, and very few of them get to that significant size. It's very, very rare. But it is possible during those severe weather conditions. I'll go to the next slide. And I think this is the big takeaway I want to just reiterate is that, yes, those large wildfires are possible, but under very specific circumstances. What's much more likely is those smaller wildfires, those 5 hectare or less small fires. And I really want to emphasize those fires, while we call that a moderate risk, that fire can be very impactful if it happens in the wrong place and it happens really close to homes or values, and it can cause pretty significant damage. And I'll go to the next slide. And I think this is a really good example of the types of wildfire we're worried about in the CDF, the types of moderate wildfire that we can worry about that can happen with relatively high frequency. This fire is on Mill Hill in Langford in 2020. This is an area I'm very familiar with. I've done a lot of community wildfire planning in this area. And it happened in a sparser CDF forest, but I think it is illustrative because, as you can see, this fire, I think, was about 4 hectares when it was all said and done, happened right beside homes, within 10 meters of homes. And I'm quite friendly with the fire chief here, and he credits these homes being saved because they're built with fire smart principles in mind. That was actually a requirement for this development, was that these homes were built to a really high standard of fire smart. Now, I'm very aware that a lot of homes and a lot of people who live in the CDF don't live in neighborhoods or homes that look exactly like this. So it is a bit of a dramatic example, but it's a really illustrative example of the types of fires we can expect in the interface and how effective some of those fire smart tools we have can be. Next slide. So how can we prepare? Fire smart is going to be extremely effective. at protecting your home and your property from the types of wildfires that we expect with relatively high frequency in the CDF. And one of the things I really like to drill on, and as you'll see, I haven't shown any graphics here because I think a lot of the FireSmart graphics paint a picture of the optimum FireSmart home. And it implies that there's like a yes or a no, that you're either FireSmart or you're not. And that's not the case at all. And that's not something I want anyone to take away from here. It's that FireSmart is a process. Me and Ruth were chatting about it the other day, and I was explaining, I like to think about it in a series of faders and like the volume knob in your car. And if it's maxed out, you just want to work on those little actions that can slowly reduce that volume down. And you might not ever get it all the way down to no vulnerability, but any action that you take is going to be effective, especially within that 10-meter zone right around your house. And if you're really focusing on those things that are easy wins, that's always going to be effective at just reducing that vulnerability slowly and slowly and slowly. And with that, I am going to kick it back over to you, Ruth.
Thank you, Conor. So one of the things that I would really like you to maybe speak to is, I'm sure it's on people's mind, we're talking about fire, and Bob mentioned a little bit about lightning is going to increase. And I know, talking to our fire assistant chief here on Salt Spring, that lightning is very, very uncommon. So it was in our Southern Gulf Islands, the number they gave me a couple of years ago was less than 3% of fires were caused by lightning. And I think if you could maybe talk a little bit, for example, with the Nanaimo, that's quite a large fire. And what was the cause? So what is the cause of the fire, and what are the features of that particular forest that caused that fire to spread? So I know climate is part of it, but if you could talk a little bit about the fuels, maybe.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a great question, because one of the reasons we see these catastrophic wildfires so infrequently is because not only do we need those weather conditions to be almost perfect, we also need a source of ignitions. And when we think about a place like the interior where we have lots of wildfires, they experience a huge amount of lightning. And when I say a huge amount of lightning, there's some storms that are several thousand air to ground lightning strikes in one storm. And that's the type where you can have hundreds of ignitions. That's very, very rare here on the coast. And that also would need to happen almost immediately after or during when we have those perfect weather conditions. I think with the Nanaimo Lakes wildfire, the ultimate cause was unknown, but it is in a very popular recreation area. I think I think the most common theory is that it was human caused, either probably through negligence or something. And it also happened in an area with a lot of human use. So I think that is like a very popular theory, and I think it's probably accurate. I don't think there was any lightning detected in advance of that wildfire.
I'm not surprised to hear that, because that's consistent with my conversations with our local fire crews, which is that lightning strikes, they have not seen them lead to big fires, and that the big fires, they're usually something that was maybe thought to be put out but has continued to burn. And so it reignites when the weather conditions shift and allow it to have more access to fuel. So I think that's thank you. That's an important point. And in the Gulf Islands, did you see much difference in terms of, from the community's perspective? Do they all sort of look similar in terms of the fuels that they have? I know the maps that you showed at the beginning, or is there quite a lot of variability from one island to another?
I would say the variability varies. Basically, I think the biggest factor is the scale of human disturbance within these islands, and there's no specific pattern. I think the obvious thing that people think is that it's basically how much forestry is there in this area. And that's actually not a great predictor of the variation in the fuels, because there's also a lot of development that really has impacted and created disturbance on the landscape. Some of the areas where we have some of the most concerning highly disturbed forests are actually areas with almost zero forestry and zero active harvesting. There's just been a lot of disturbance through development. But I would say there's no obvious pattern that comes to mind for a lot of these communities.
Great. Thank you. That's really important message. And I think also that image showing that this small neighborhood of houses, that the Fire Smart had a really important role to play. So, and this is getting, I think, so this is a great lead up to Becky, I think, because you know, I know the people on this call are interested and concerned about fire, but also with the Island Trust, we're all concerned about stewardship. And there's this interplay between, if we don't have trees and after a fire, whether it's because of the development, then we have soils being washed off when we get these heavy rains, and we have more heat accumulation in these open areas. So there's an interaction between the choices that we make and the conditions on the ground. And I know people are very concerned about how do we steward things. So fire is going to happen. It happens, it's usually small. And there are some things you can do immediately around your house with Fire Smart that can make a difference. And Becky is going to take us a step further and talk beyond that 100-meter sort of Fire Smart area, and how her experience in thinking about and actually managing some of these forests to make them more resilient. And so, as Bob mentioned, so we're very privileged to have another fire expert. So this is, what a great panel. We have Becky Miller, who's a forest ecologist with Parks Canada, who has worked a lot on the issue of fire, and has been very involved with forest restoration programs on Sydney Island. Becky has worked for 10 years both in coastal and inland forests in BC and in Oregon. So she has quite a wide understanding of different systems and the different kinds of behaviors and patterns and regimes that you can see. And also over 10 years, things are changing pretty quick. So it'll be interesting to hear what Becky's observations are about that. Becky has a really strong background in looking at the ecological dynamics across different forest conditions and types, including this more localized climate patterns within old growth forest canopies. And so that versus the kind of forests that we're currently seeing around us in a dominant way is an interesting question. If we want to be stewards and we want to have systems, what exactly are we talking about? So Becky, we're really looking forward to you sort of getting into some of the more specifics about what does this look like and what are some things that people can do.
That's great. Thank you, Ruth. So we have a lot to cover. I mean, talking about the ecology of fire and forests beyond just that 100 meters is obviously a big topic. I know we're short on time, so as I kind of work through these next slides, I'm just going to be talking about these topics very generally, with the understanding that we can circle back to slides or points to discuss nuance like a little bit later in our kind of question and answer period. So I wanted to circle back to kind of this climate trajectory that Bob was talking about, but really emphasize that these CDF forests have evolved with fire. And we're talking about long evolutionary time, not just the last couple of decades or hundreds of years. So records going back to early Holocene, which was a really warm and dry period, shows that throughout this region, there was just a diversity of fire sizes, severities, and frequencies. And that's what we call pyrodiversity. And that diversity of fire was due both to indigenous burning as well as natural ignitions. And at this time of a quite high pyrodiversity, we see an increase in the amount of Gary oak that's present across the region. And following climate patterns, pyrodiversity kind of increases and decreases until the Little Ice Age. And that's kind of a time that's recent enough for many of us to relate to. It was a very cool and wet period with a substantial decrease in moderate and high severity fire, but still showing an abundance of low severity fire. And that's specifically due to intentional indigenous burning. From that little ice age, which was 1300s to about mid 1800s, we move from that period toward the present day. And it's that cool and wet period of the little ice age that has made modern fire suppression possible. Bob was talking about those patterns of wetting fuels and sort of recharging that moisture. At this time of moving into a period of fire suppression, colonization was in full swing. Cultural indigenous burning was banned. We have an excess of post-World War II soldiers and aircraft that really made fighting fire in an aggressive way very successful. And without that pyrodiversity of the past multiple thousands of years, we started to see a real substantial increase in the abundance of vegetation. Bob also talked about kind of overstocked forests. And we particularly see an increase in the abundance of conifers. We also see increased fuel accumulation relative to those earlier historical periods. And we also see a connectivity of that fuel across the landscape, as opposed to conditions earlier in time where we had that biodiversity, we had cultural burning occurring, and we saw much more open forests, much more patchy forests, and kind of a change in composition toward those more deciduous type species. So we'll go ahead and move to the next slide. So that brings us to our present day, where we're in this sort of wildfire paradox. This is talked about a lot in the fire community, that aggressive fire suppression has been so successful that we are actually finding ourselves, when we're thinking about fire in the large landscape and regional scale, we find ourselves in an increased risk of that high severity fire, as well as degraded ecological health of these ecosystems that have evolved and actually depend on fire. Go ahead, we can move to the next slide. So I think it's important to acknowledge that fire managers increasingly find themselves in very complex decision-making space. As Bob was talking about, extreme weather events are becoming more and more frequent. We have, like the Conor was mentioning, so much more human development throughout the landscape. We've had this historical period of time where fire suppression has been successful, but we're increasingly seeing economic, social, and ecological pressures and just the realities of how extremely expensive and risky and not really possible it is to aggressively suppress and remove fire totally from the landscape. So we're starting to see this shift to kind of what I call a new paradigm. I want to just add an asterisk there. New in terms of the Western view and approach to fire management, but of course not new if we are considering and taking into account the indigenous and more cultural approach to fire management. So that new paradigm has been termed by fire ecologists as the more ecological fire management period. Basically, fire managers starting to let nature burn in order to benefit future risk management as well as ecological health. And letting nature burn, of course, also has an asterisk next to it. We're not seeing, of course, decisions to let fire burn through communities, but instead understanding a landscape and fire hazard and fire benefits throughout a landscape, and making decisions before fire is present about under what conditions fire could be restorative, under what conditions fire can be detrimental and get out of control, and starting to let fire do the good work that it needs to do, and do the good work that it has been doing in these systems for thousands of years. So one thing that I know I will talk about, and I'm sure in the question and answer period will come up, is kind of these terms, good and bad fire. And I think it's important to recognize, of course, that fire is a force of nature. It is what it is. But good and bad value assignments tend to refer to the effect that the fire is having on the ecosystem. So extreme weather events, like Bob was talking about, and the consequently very extreme fire behavior and extreme fire effects, like high severity across a large portion of land, can radically change an ecosystem. And the coastal Douglas fir systems evolved with low to moderate fire severity regimes. High severity fire is also natural. There, like I was referring to earlier, this is a very pyro-diverse system. But the sort of good fire that we like to talk about, and we'll continue to talk about in this conversation, refers to the kind of fire that, rather than radically changing and destroying an ecosystem, actually perpetuates the ecosystem. So that good fire is how we can kind of characterize the past thousands of years of intentional burning and natural ignitions that have perpetuated the existence of Gary oak and these more open Douglas fir systems and Gary oak meadows. And so that, I guess, preparing for good fire means taking advantage of those non-extreme weather periods or climate conditions. And it's those non-extreme periods where we can start to reintroduce fire to the system and try to do that so that we have good fire, creating those ecosystems that we value and find so special and unique in this part of Canada. So I think we'll go ahead and skip to the next slide. So as other panelists have said, realistically, fire is coming, whether it's planned or not. Human ignitions are the top cause of fire throughout this region. Like Conor mentioned, we don't really experience currently a ton of lightning, and it's most often just accidental human-caused fire. But the CDF ecosystem depends on healthy, good fire, not these random, infrequent, massive high severity fires. And so when we talk about whether or not we can and should reintroduce good fire to the system, our goal really is to avoid those large scale ecological losses across the ecosystem. Now, that ecological loss could be due to high severity fires, but it can also be due to the lack of fire. These systems have co-developed with fire, and if we expect to see them stick around in this area, fire does need to be a part of those systems again. Luckily, of course, we have very good foundations to work from. the species in the coastal Douglas fir, many of them are fire adapted. They can survive and thrive in good fire and even throughout drought. I mean, many of these individual species extend much farther south into the US, existing in a lot hotter and drier conditions than we are currently seeing in the Gulf Islands today. So from here on out, I'm just going to talk about some of the ways that we can prepare our landscapes for experiencing that good fire. There's a lot of nuance here, which we'll get into later on, but these are all methods that have been extensively researched in the Western US. And it would do us good to learn from that work and try and understand what we can incorporate in this region. So I'll go ahead and move to the next slide. So I want to emphasize, again, the goal of having healthy, good fire effects. That is, fire can move through a system and the species in that system and the way that that ecosystem functions is perpetuated, not radically changed. And the best guide that we can follow is historical conditions in those fire adapted systems. And I want to be very clear that this does not mean turning back the clock to some static condition of an ecosystem, but rather it's understanding the patterns of burning and the patterns of forest structure that occurred historically to better understand how fire might behave in our current conditions and how we might change our current ecosystem conditions to better receive good fire. We'll go ahead and move to the next slide, please. So if we're thinking about good fire being part of our landscape scale management, then our focus starts to shift to vegetation structure and sort of overall ecological health. And native vegetation restoration is one of the first valuable tools to implement because it does strongly relate to fire behavior and fire effects. Now, as Bob was mentioning earlier, the way that fuel is behaving, or I guess I should say, the way that vegetation is translating into wildfire fuel is changing and will continue to change as the climate changes. However, again, thinking to historical conditions, these ecosystems had a lot less vegetation, had particular players in the ecosystem, particular species that were prevalent and sort of patchily abundant. And it's that kind of thinking about vegetation patterns across the landscape that is really important here. So we'll get into a bit more of that detail in the question and answer period, but I just wanted to drop in the idea of active native vegetation restoration as a way to change how fire behaves across a landscape. And so we'll move to the next slide. And so a second important preparatory tool is fire treatment, or excuse me, fuel treatments. So want to be clear that when I say fuel treatments, we're generally referring to cultural and or prescribed burning, as well as restorative thinning. So we'll go ahead and move to the next slide. And I think just for the sake of time, we'll kind of wait to discuss nuances of fuel. But as alluded to earlier, preparing for good fire does require that we think about how fuel will burn. when in a season fire might occur, intentional fire, like good fire might occur, and how fuel or vegetation and structure can actually change the physics of fire, which has a really big outcome for how a fire behaves on the landscape. So go ahead and move to the next slide, please. Wrapped up in that conversation of fuel, of course, is that when we're talking about fuel, is anything that can burn, live vegetation, dead vegetation, rotting wood, standing dead wood. That fuel, of course, is also food and shelter for critical species in the ecosystem. It helps control physical processes like hydrology, as well as nutrient cycling in these systems. So all of these roles of fuel must be considered when we're thinking about if and where to implement fuel treatments. Go ahead, next slide, please. And so one component of a fuel treatment is cultural burning. That can be, I guess I should say, cultural burning and or prescribed burning. And there's some pretty important differences there, which if we have time, we can kind of get into that. But I think it's very important to acknowledge yet again that these coastal Douglas fir systems were shaped by indigenous fire over thousands of years. And when we think about the restoration of these systems, that restoration is just inextricably linked to the recovery and restoration of cultural burning practices and intentional prescribed fire, intentionally putting fire back onto the landscape. But we are finding, throughout the whole Western North America, that due to fire exclusion, many of these places in Douglas fir ecosystems are just not currently suitable for the reintroduction of good fire. So this slide and then the following slide just on the left is showing a prescribed burn, in this case, under conditions where we can expect low severity fire, and that prescribed burning is actually possible. And then images on the right being the same kind of system, but with radical shifts in the amount of vegetation there and the type of vegetation present that really makes it not possible to have these kind of good burns. So we'll go ahead and move to the next slide. Again, just illustrating massive accumulations of fuel and just changes in the way these systems are appearing, which really prevent many locations from just having cultural or prescribed fire reintroduced today. So we'll go ahead and move to the next slide. So another fuel treatment approach is restorative thinning. And I'm sure we'll have, again, lots of discussion on this, but I just want to be clear that restorative thinning does not refer to the creation of a fuel break. And this is also not clear cutting. This is not standard forestry practices. So what we're talking about can kind of take on a few different appearances. One way that restorative thinning might occur is just intentional thinning to save individual fire-resistant trees. So in these images, we have conifers encroaching on oak woodlands. Eventually, those conifers overtop oaks, and we see the death of these oak species, which are well adapted to fire and historically would have been much more open and ready to receive that, have that good fire on the landscape. We'll go ahead and skip to the next slide. And another example of restorative thinning is thinning at a stand scale to reduce tree density and to increase patchiness of that forest cover to emulate those historic conditions. Again, the idea here being that many stands throughout these coastal duck's systems are just overstocked relative to warmer, drier periods of time. And as we move toward those kind of warm, dry conditions, these systems aren't going to be able to support that high density of trees and vegetation. And so rather than waiting for an accidental escaped fire to turn into a high severity fire in some key locations, restorative thinning to kind of reduce that density and again, kind of recreate or emulate historic conditions can help moderate or change fire behavior on the landscape. Go ahead and move to it. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Becky. That's great. I think I know we could talk about this. I really feel like I could talk about this for 24 hours, but we kind of need a second part to go deeper. But we have questions coming in, and I think this is a great time. Now we've given people a whole big spectrum of questions, and there's some that have come up that are quite basic that I think it'd be good to take a moment to look at. Like one, for example, is someone is asking for clarification on fine versus coarse fuels. So that even goes back maybe, Bob, to the beginning when you were talking about large pieces of wood. And I don't know who would like to field this question.
Yeah, so fine fuels are grasses, fine twigs, leaf litter. Basically, they gain and lose moisture very rapidly.
So, Bob, your sound is not good. Can you try that again?
Can you hear me now?
Yep. So try again, because your sound was a little bit funny there at the beginning.
Yeah. So fine fuels are grasses, small twigs, needles, leaves. Basically, fuels that are small enough that they gain and lose moisture very quickly, and they're sort of key to relative humidity. So as humidity rises, those fuels take on moisture and they don't burn as rapidly. The larger pieces of the larger wood particles get from branches, the small limbs, the boles, to down logs, things like that. It takes longer to gain moisture and longer to lose moisture. So those fuels tend to change over the course of hours to days to months. So if we think about the fuels that are most available to burn on a daily basis, it's those fine fuels, grasses, leaf litter, things like that. And then larger fuels, they take longer to dry out. Once they are dry, they're harder to moisten and become less available. So fine fuels contribute to rapid fire spread. Larger fuels contribute to those ecological impacts that Becky referred to, and that's impacts on soils, air quality, carbon, all those things.
So then now we're getting into kind of like, I think this is really important. This is certainly what I know a lot of people will be thinking about when at this time of year. And I would say I guess my first preamble would be, now is not the time to clean your yards. You should be cleaning it in the rainy season, not waiting till now, because we have this great period of time to take the limbs down and accumulate and redistribute fuels on around your house and move them further away. Can we just talk a little bit about with people? Maybe we can do a round with everybody. What are some ideas of the accumulation of fuels in whatever form that you might find in the spring or in the winter time from the storms in the winter? And how would you look at it? Maybe Becky, I'll start with you. If you've got your house and you've got a forested area around you and you've got twigs and branches and maybe some larger diameter things, how would you think about approaching it, and how would you consider moving those fuels and managing them?
Sure, I'm sure Conor will have some to speak to as well. But if we're standing in our home and we're looking out, if you happen to be up against, say, a forested area, fuels that are hanging off the ground, maybe branches that have been downed in some sort of windstorm or snow event, and you have branches that are dead and hanging. Anything that is no longer in contact with the ground will dry out much faster than things that are in contact with the ground. If we're looking through the winter and then spring, when we do start to see some warmer temperatures, but we still have that moisture, decomposition is really important for changing how fuels, and particularly fine fuels, influence fire intensity and fire behavior. So the more that small stuff can decompose, the better for immediately surrounding your home. I find a really easy way to think about this is that you don't go start your campfire with the largest wood you can find. You start with the small stuff, and you start with the small dry stuff. And so it's just the same kind of concept. However, when we start to think about fuel as kind of thinking of differences between live and dead fuel, that also kind of changes the game a bit as well. So that live fuel, live vegetation, of course, in springtime and often into the summertime, is retaining moisture. You have green leaves that are retaining moisture, and that kind of fuel will burn and influence fire behavior differently than some of the vegetation that grows and blooms early and dies off very quickly and is dead and dry for the remainder of the fire season. So I guess I'll probably hand it off here, but there doesn't need to be a panicked, run out into the forest and sweep up every piece of dead log you can find. It's really thinking more about those fine fuels and what's dry versus what's decomposing versus what's live.
Yeah, so not having a carpet of material to carry the spread of fire is, as Bob said, this fine materials, so that what we're doing is not preventing fire necessarily, but we're going to aim to prevent the movement of fire across the landscape. Conor, do you have a couple of insights to share with people? So now we're looking beyond the fire smart area, presuming everyone's fire smart of their property, which I know a lot of people in Salt Spring, it's very popular to do this, which is good, but people want to know what to do beyond that area, especially with fuels.
Yeah, for sure. I think the simplest way I like to describe it to people is separation. Fuels burn really well when they're continuous, both vertically and horizontally, and you want to disrupt that. You want to disrupt that both forms of that continuity by creating separation. So, like Becky was saying, you want to get those fine fuels. If they're continuous on the ground, you want to get them discontinuous. You want to spread them out, break them up, dispose of them. You want to prune the lower branches of those trees. You want to get rid of that small vegetation to create that vertical separation. And if you have things like a really long grass, that stuff is really easy to deal with actually, because you can just mow it and you're creating that separation, or you can mow strips into it and create that separation. And to bring it back into Fire Smart, that same separation principle applies. You're just thinking of your house and you want separation from your house and those fuels.
Right. And so really what we're talking about is you don't necessarily need to remove everything from that beyond that 100-meter area. You just need to manage it so that you're creating interruptions in the potential movement. And then a fire won't necessarily start everywhere. So you can start prioritizing by areas where an ignition is most likely to be introduced, or for fire is more likely to come in. So you can be strategic with this. So this question is a bit complicated, so I've got it up here. Does anyone feel that this is something that we can field in a brief response? What do we feel about the current fuel abatement policies, and should there be changes moving forward? I guess, my gut reaction to this would be we don't really have, we have some for forestry, but I'm not sure we have them for private land areas. Bob?
But a couple of the biggest ones are right now, our harvest footprint in the province is anywhere from 130 to 150,000 hectares a year, and those aren't field treatments. Those are harvest operations, and so they are directly contributing to sort of landscape scale fuel continuity problems. So we need changes in policy there so that we can incentivize timber companies, whether on private land or public land, to basically utilize more material, leave only large logs in the landscape, scattered large logs, take all the smaller stuff out, and then those treatments, they're still not fuel treatments, but they're not contributing to the problem. The second thing, and Becky brought this up, and I think Conor did too, is like just one size doesn't fit all. Whether you're working, within that home and ignition zone around your house or a larger property or forest doing restoration work, each site is unique, and there are tools that we use, thinning and prescribed burning, but they need to be tailored to the topography, the slope aspect, the ecosystem that we're in. So cookie cutter things don't work. We need to be more aggressive when it comes to the removal of biomass. So those are the two kind of key policy things we need to work on.
Yeah. So that's complicated in the Island Trust area because 80% of the land is actually in private, control, not in Crown control. So I don't actually think that there's much in the way of policy, but I'll just let you know that there is a conversation going on among practitioners and operational people right now, including people on this panel, that we're having conversation about what that might look like. And I did want to sort of pose one question that someone that I know who is a private forest manager, not just to himself, but others with these large tracts of land they're responsible for, they would like to do better, but they're asking what kind of resources and programs or funding might exist to help them to be using a more stewardship, wetland, ecological sort of approach to things, carbon storage, etc. Does anyone know? And Bob, I know you wanted to make comment, but is anyone aware of programs or support for this? Because I certainly am not, beyond Fire Smart.
There's no incentivized programs for the bioeconomy especially.
So, sorry, could you say that again, Bob? That when you start talking, it can be a little bit quirky at first, your mic.
Yeah, we're basically talking about whether it's the bioeconomy or program. No financial incentive to do that. There are no programs right now.
Okay, there are no programs. Okay, and yeah, so there we go. Okay.
Sorry, Ruth, I wanted to jump in and Bob, sorry, circling back to something just before we started our webinar, when you were talking into your, different microphone earlier, it was the sound was a little bit strange, but it was much less garbled. So I don't know if there's an alternative way that you could speak or what microphone you could use. But right now it seems that it starts off really garbled.
It does. It starts off, and then once you're talking for a little bit, it seems to work itself out. But it's
is this any better?
Yes, it is.
I don't know.
Magic. So this question about glyphosate, I am actually going to pass this one, and I will just this is a complex question, and I'm going to suggest that some questions, so we'll move to the next one with apologies, but this is one that we'll do a bit of work on and get an answer for following this webinar. Okay, so Fire Smart programs are to protect homes, people. Are you aware of public programs can help educate people on how to prevent wildfires? So again, I would say if we talk specifically about the Island Trust area, I am not aware of programs, although there may be individual groups on specific islands that are doing some leadership in this area. Conor, did you come across any educational programs? I know on Salt Spring there's some interest in people creating an educational program using the Island Trust regulatory system, but are you aware of anything?
Yeah, I do know that the Capital Regional District is doing their best to support the local fire departments in rolling out some educational initiatives. I know Salt Spring had a pretty good Fire Smart program with a huge education component, but I will say that education is by far, out of everything we've talked about today, one of the hardest things to do about these wildfire risks and about what's safe and what's negligent behavior in the forest. And I think people just don't know, and it's really hard to reach people and educate them. I think people aren't out there intentionally starting wildfires. They're just doing things that they don't even realize are extremely high risk. And we're trying our best and we're trying to come up with tools to reach people, but it is really difficult. So the good news is we're trying. The bad news is it's an uphill battle for sure.
I think that gets to Bob's point as well, which is that and Becky as well, that it depends, that unfortunately it's very context specific. And so it's very hard to have, and there was a question that I saw where people were asking, do you go to an arborist? Who do you go to for this? And again, we're having a conversation among operational and practitioner people about this, but if anyone, does anyone have a suggestion? I think arborists would be people who you could have a conversation along the lines of what Becky was talking about, how to use a restorative lens to thinning and managing the forest. An arborist would probably be very well positioned to do that and could actually respond. Becky, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think an arborist is appropriate for, if you wanted to talk about limbing trees around the proximity of your home, but this really highlights a major gap that we have here in BC, and particularly relevant, of course, our region of the Gulf Islands and Vancouver Island itself, is that there are practitioners that are ecological foresters and forest management companies that have an ecological perspective. That is far more frequent as we get into the Western US. And that's just due to different social and legal pressures. But there is definitely an increasing need for that kind of perspective here in BC, where there would be an increase in the prevalence of consulting companies that could come and help talk about what could be done on one's property, sort of help identify ecological values and how things like vegetation restoration might help break up fuel continuity, how restorative thinning might be implemented at individual tree level or larger scale. And then additionally, a major support system in the US is the Extension Service. And that is publicly funded service that provides experts in all of these subject areas and beyond, and create private homeowner support systems for managing your land.
That's right. And that's not something that we do have in place, but it is something that we definitely need, and people are aware of this need. So I know you'll see that we've gone a little bit over. If people can stay, please leave, and know that more information will be posted following up with questions. But if people can stay for maybe another 10 minutes, and we'll try to address a few more questions. I think some of the questions that I'm seeing coming up, and so I just mentioned also that the University of Victoria has got a restoration of natural systems program, and I am working, me and others are working in collaboration with the faculty in this program, looking at questions about what are the properties of the native plants, how can we restore our wetlands, the kind of things that Becky is talking about. So if you're interested in learning, that I can point you to UVic. And the other thing I was thinking is it might be nice for us to come up with maybe a list of some references or groups that we can point people to, because there are questions like what are appropriate native plants for slopes or native plants, and there are information out there. So rather than answering those questions, I'll just say that we'll try to gather some information for people. So there's an interesting question just to get into the historical context. So people don't, we're all used to what these forests look like here. And I know on Vancouver Island, we may be aware of more changes, but the things have been changed, had been changed much longer ago on the islands. And so there's the question here is, the ban on cultural burning led to the dominance of coastal Douglas fir. Were the forests more diverse historically? So I think I had this question also I wanted to ask you, all of you, and maybe Becky and Bob are most familiar with this. Walk us through what the forests would have looked like when it was more actively managed through the cultural burning and other practices.
I can jump in for just a quick, Becky, and then you want to. I think it's important to look at forest structure was very different. Composition may not have been much different. I mean, less Douglas fir, more arbutus and dairy oak. But I think the difference, and Becky pointed this out, is that it would have been in the understory. Much more diverse herbaceous grass shrub component than there is today. You walk into a lot of these stands and they're depauperate. They've shaded out, most of the native species. Hopefully through restoration, some of them have seed banked. But in a lot of cases with large areas of this encroachment where it's basically moss or just depauperate, we don't know what the native species composition was. So I think the big loss hasn't been forest composition, and so forest structure has changed, but certainly understory species have.
Mm-hmm. I definitely see that in the areas that I'm working. And so I know that from what I'm seeing myself, I see on the top of mounts, you get sometimes these beautiful, enormous arbutus trees that are now dying and they definitely are 100 years old plus, and they're dying because there's been encroachment of Doug fir at the crust of a very, very shallow, there's not very much soil, and that this is a relatively recent phenomenon, which gets me thinking that the landscapes were much more open and patchy. And so that fire perhaps wouldn't have been able to spread in the way it does when we have these tree densities where, if I'm looking at the picture behind you, Bob, I mean, what's missing is not just the understory, but it's the diversity of tree age as well. And that's, so what people are asking when people are, one good question here is, what are some useful practical suggestions for island residences to implement? Because perhaps right now it seems like, okay, native plants and, maybe moving fuel around, but maybe we can finish and just take a moment for each of you to say, what I would do, I would look at my property like this, and here are some of the things I would think about, and here are some of the things that I would do. So should we start with you, Conor?
Yeah, you bet. First thing I would do is, I know we always say this, it's really annoying to hear. I would go to the FireSmart BC website, pull out the assessment, and I'm a pretty lazy person, and I'm going to pull out those things and I'm going to do all the easiest stuff first. And it's probably going to be something like sweep your deck, clean out your gutters. Maybe that's even one of the harder ones. Sweep your deck, mow your lawn, do all the easier stuff first. Some of it can be done in a couple minutes, couple hours. And then once you do that, start looking at some of the bigger things like disrupting that continuity, like we talked about. But generally just think about how you can bring in just general landscaping maintenance, FireSmart practices into what you're already doing. Like most people are already regularly maintaining their properties, and it's hopefully not too much extra work to start doing some of this stuff, and just really start small and try and work your way up to some of the bigger things you can do.
Mm-hmm. Great. So Becky, I'm going to go to you. So if we step beyond that FireSmart bounds, what would you look at, and how would you think about the things that you needed to do, and where the top priorities were?
Yeah. So if you have more land than just beyond your home and yard that is currently your responsibility, then I think it's really important to take a walk through it and just start to jot down notes about topographical features. What's the terrain like? Do you have water moving through? Do you have a creek? Do you have seasonal wet seeps? And at the same time that you're walking around looking at that topography, kind of the geography of things, also taking notes about what kind of species you see in the overstory, particularly paying attention to large size trees. You may find that there are some areas where, just like you mentioned, you might see really large arbutus trees, or maybe even really large Gary oak trees, and immediately surrounding it are all small diameter pole, like rigid straight pole Douglas fir trees and grand fir. And so just starting to kind of jot down those kind of patterns that you're observing. There might be other areas that are steep slope north facing and you see large grand fir and a bunch of, like, you know, maybe a carpet of grand fir regenerating an understory. Then you can kind of take a step back and really consider what is ecologically happening on your property. Those areas where you have maybe water flowing through, or wet seeps, you can start to think about restoring native vegetation there. Those wet kind of water breaks and wet riparian zones are really good at slowing down fire and changing fire behavior. If you're walking around and you're seeing those large arbutus or Gary oak trees that clearly have been there for a long time, and they're surrounded by fuel like those Douglas pole-sized Douglas fir or grand fir trees that are directly in contact with the canopy of these more fire resilient species, consider thinning out those pole-sized trees that are growing up in connection with those larger trees. We want to give space to those fire resilient trees so that if fire does move through, they don't just immediately burn up into the canopy and target those large old trees. But we also want to give space for those tree species to regenerate and have the light conditions to regenerate and perpetuate themselves. And then I guess sort of a third thing to pay attention to is the understory vegetation as you're walking through these spaces. Is it dark in the middle of the day? You cannot see the light and there's absolutely no understory vegetation. That might give you pause, and you might want to think about doing some patchy thinning. If you're walking around and you're seeing vegetation, but it's just a massive carpet of Scotch broom or a massive carpet of blackberry, you may want to consider seriously targeting and doing a large-scale invasive species removal.
So you mean Himalayan blackberry?
Himalayan blackberry, yes. That is a good distinction between our native trailing blackberry.
Yes.
The way that those fuels grow, the way that they take over an area, and in some cases like Scotch broom, sort of the chemical composition of those species can really change, again, how a fire behaves, how intensely a fire burns, how long a fire sticks around in one area, and that can lead to really amplified fire behavior that's just like a lot harder to control and has a lot more serious impacts on the landscape.
That's great. Thank you, Becky. I think that might seem a little bit overwhelming for people, but we will put some resources out there. But also, you know, a couple of points that I would add based on my observations and going to other islands is I think there were also a lot more wet areas and seeps and wetlands than we currently have, and we're really good at draining our properties. And remember that, you know, in a sense, yes, you don't want flooding, but maybe in the spring you want to close those drains and start to retain water in your on your lands. And if you see these areas that are seeps, and so the trees are more likely to get disease and more likely to fall, maybe raise the water table there. So this is what Becky's getting at, is start to look around and see what's going on. And we need to shift that. We want to keep the water in the winter, and we want to keep the humidity. And then the vegetation, if you pick the right ones, is good at doing that. So, but it needs light. And so Bob put a great comment in here. So I'm going to segue over to you, Bob, which is, with the questions, an arborist could do this kind of work and could help you carry out a prescription that's developed by a fire expert. Now, I'm going to hand over to you, Bob, but I will say there are not enough fire experts for what we need. And so this is where we do need to start to compile resources, and why this discussion is so important that the Island Trust hosted. So I want to thank them again. And then I'll pass over to you again, Bob, to give your thoughts on what advice do you want to leave with people about what can I do, Bob?
So in addition to the UVic restoration program, UBC Okanagan has a brand new fire certificate, fire ecology and management certificate program. It's a 5-module, 150-hour self-directed program that will give you a lot of background in fire ecology, fire science, fire management, fuels, cultural fire, all those things. So I think there's about 250 people on the waiting list, but the modules are basically coming out, and it's not overly expensive to do that. So it's a good start.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there aren't a lot of us fire ecologists in the province. There's going to be more. But there's a lot of people, who've got a pretty good solid fire background. And people like Conor and others who've spent time on the fire line, and they studied a little bit of fire science. So it's just important that if you're developing objectives that are geared to understanding ecology and fire ecology, then that direction needs to come from experts in that. Arborists and others can carry out those prescriptions, but guiding it needs to be solidly coming from the realm of fire science. So
yeah.
So anyway, so there are tools out there. We can provide lots of links for people or information. The Joint Fire Science Program in the US with all the fire science consortiums, it's all free information. Once again, like Becky said, there's tons of research it's been carried out in the Northwestern US. Some of that is we have collaborations with those folks across the border here. So lots of information that, we never had 10, 15, 20 years ago, and there's so much at our fingertips today. So
thank you, Bob. So I'm just going to close by thanking the panelists and saying that the message that I hope everyone will take is start with the simple, obvious, that, as Conor said, then get to know go and have a look and see what you'll start to see with different eyes. And, big is more fire resistant, and start to read the land. And then, as Bob says, there are places like you don't have to take a whole degree. You can take some courses and learn things. You can, track the Island Trust, who is hosting things like this as they come up, and watch for people in your community who might be giving a talk and may be knowledgeable. So there's a whole spectrum, and we will put together resources from the simple to the deeper for people, and give it to Jillian to post. Thank you very much, Jillian, and thank you everyone for your patience in this discussion today.
Maybe before we leave, I just want to say thank you all. Thank you, Robert and Ruth, and Becky and Conor. But I just want to make sure people know where to go. We're going to send an email with all the registrants, of course, with information, so it'll be in your email. But just in case, I'm just going to quickly share my screen, which I was going to do at the very beginning. Hopefully you can see that. So this is the Islands Trust website. So what you do is you go to programs, and then you hit Stewardship Education, and it just pops up here. And then you can see all the previous webinars that we've done in the past, and then tonight's webinar. So this will change, and it'll look more like this with a recording, and then we'll provide the any supporting material that we've talked about here. So we did get lots of questions, and unfortunately we didn't have a lot of time, but as we said, we'll do our best. Panelists will do their best to answer the questions after, and we will post them. So thank you all for coming. Yeah, thank you. And I think we're going to end it there. So if everyone, yeah, can head out, say goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Yep, thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.